What's up, Nerfers? This week, I'm going to be upgrading the Worker Seagull with some new CNC metal parts thanks to my good friend Sabre over in Singapore. These upgrades would also work for the more powerful Harrier blaster, and they're sold by both Out of Darts in the USA and Foamwork Adelaide here in Australia. Find all the upgrade parts at the links down below. If you haven't seen my review videos of the Harrier or Seagull, I'm not sure why you're here, but I'll link them at the end of this video just so you can be caught up to speed. The original parts I'll be replacing include the plastic plunger rod, plastic catch, and the plastic priming block. Let's get started. Just like you would do to access the spring, I'm starting out by removing the two rear screws of the top Picatinny rail. I've got the rear iron sight mounted just far enough forward that I can get to the rear screw. That other screw is located midway along the rail, and it could potentially be covered up by a sight if you have one attached. Next, just remove the two side screws that hold the front and back halves of the Seagull together. Worth mentioning is that with the 1.6 by 300mm spring I have inside, there's quite a lot of pre-compression, so I did have to push the two halves of the blaster together a bit to release that tension and to be able to pull the screws out. For the front half of the Seagull, just remove two screws on the sides and then it clamshells apart. Next, on the rear half of the Seagull, remove the stock with the side screw. This conveniently uses the same screwdriver bit as the entire rest of the blaster. Now for the fun part, removing the rubberized grip. I found it easiest to kind of turn it inside out and peel it off, but it is a little annoying to do since it does grip so well. With the rubberized grip removed, now all that's left to do is remove all the screws from the two halves of the blaster. Just make sure you pay attention to where they all came out of because some are longer than the others. That's something I didn't do, and you'll see it come back to bite me later. But with all of the screws removed, you can clamshell apart the front and the rear halves of the Seagull, revealing the internals. The very first thing I'm going to do, you could actually do to any Harrier or Seagull without having any of the metal parts. You'll notice on the plunger tube, there's actually a hole in the side of it. The plunger rod itself goes back further than this hole, so it does mean you're losing a tiny amount of air volume. I asked Worker why the hole is there, and apparently it's to prevent vacuum loading. My response is that's what the holes drilled in the pusher are for, so I'm just going to take some electrical tape and wrap it around the plunger tube, covering up that hole. It might not make much of a performance upgrade in the end, but I also don't believe the hole is necessary. So, may as well cover it up. While I have the plunger tube out, I'll apply some Aussie Inox MX6 lubricant to both ends in a generous amount. Just use whatever you have on hand, whether that's super lube, white silicone grease, or even Durex. But now it's time to install the first CNC metal part from Sabre, the catch. Just simply remove the plastic stock catch, paying close attention to where the catch spring shot out to across the room. Mine landed about 1 meter away from the table. You'll be smarter, of course, and expect that the spring is going to shoot out, and you'll be able to just catch it with your hand. Install the metal catch with the stock catch spring. It can be a little fiddly to get the spring in, and you might lose it across the room a couple of times trying, but this will be a nice durability upgrade for the longevity of the blaster. The next part I think is even more important than the catch, and that's especially true when using heavier than the stock springs like I'm using, and that's the CNC metal Sabre plunger rod. The stock plastic one can wear down over time and stop catching reliably or entirely. To upgrade it, just take it out and swap the stock green plunger O-ring onto the Sabre one, along with the front padding. I'll put this back into the blaster later on with the spring when I put the two halves back together again. For now, just set it aside. Sabre also sent me a Harrier mag release. The Harrier, as it turns out, actually has a shorter length than the Seagull's one, but don't let it hear you say that. Sabre will be working on a longer mag release specifically for the Seagull soon. Finally, moving to the front half of the Seagull, Sabre have sent me a CNC metal priming block to replace the stock plastic one. I hadn't actually heard of anyone having issues with the stock plastic one, but metal is better than plastic. I'd say this is probably the more optional of the metal parts, similar to the mag release, though it would help add some weight to the front end, giving the Seagull better balance overall. To install the priming block, just undo the two screws on either side of the priming bars, and then separate the priming block from the rest of the barrel and breech assembly. Then loosen the lower Picatinny rail bolt first, which will allow it to install into the new metal piece. Reattach the priming bars on either side and reposition the rubber padding at the front. The dart gate should sit in a small cutout in the top of the shell, and when it comes to re-clamshelling the blaster together, it should be an easy fit. If it doesn't just easily sit back together again, it means you have something out of alignment. Don't force it together. The same exact thing goes for the rear half. Everything should just slot perfectly back into place. Put all the screws back in. Hopefully you made a mental note of which ones go where. Though as you can see here, trial and error works too. What I did is just tried the shorter screws first, and if they didn't go, then you know it needs a longer one. And just try the next size up. Put the spring and the metal plunger rod in, and then recombine the front and rear halves of the Seagull, tightening the side screws, and finally the top Picatinny screws. A quick air seal test, and then we're done and ready for some testing. The half-length Nerf darts I'll be using today are Worker bamboos provided by Foamwork Adelaide. I've got something like 2,000 of these, and they've been my go-to for testing new blasters since they came out earlier this year. And sticking with the same darts allows me to look back at older videos and compare newer blasters to the older ones. To begin with, I'll do a chrono test of the short barrel, then a chrono test of the long barrel, and just like I mentioned, I'll be able to see how it compares to the stock Seagull from my review video 2 weeks ago. Also, just like the testing in that video, I'll have the included Worker plastic rifling attached. Let's begin with the short barrel. 238, 234, 235, 229, 228, 234, 235, 245. Can I prime this with 2 fingers? Yes. 237, 1 finger. It's actually pretty light. 236, 235, 249, 245, 242, 240. That's all 15. Just from looking at this, without even going to the numbers yet, it seems to be far more consistent than the stock blaster was. The short barrel with Worker rifling shot a high of 249, low of 228, average of 237, with a standard deviation of 5.8. Either due to the heavier metal plunger rod, or potentially because the spring's now been used for an entire day of gameplay, the blaster has now lost 7 feet per second on average since I first chronoed it. However, the standard deviation has improved from 14 down to 5.8, so I'd say it's well worth it to gain that consistency. Now let's take a look at the long barrel. 245, 252, 236, 234, 238, 257, 243, 246, 239, 243, 262, 257, 257 again, 249, 257. That's all 15 of those. The long barrel with plastic Worker rifling shot a high of 262, low of 234, average of 247, and had a standard deviation of 8.9. That's a loss of only 5 feet per second on average compared to before the metal parts, and an even greater improvement from a standard deviation of 18.9, now down to 8.9. While it does look like the metal plunger rod lost a small amount of FPS with both barrels and the 1.6 by 300mm spring, consistency has improved dramatically with both barrels. So I'd say the trade-off is worth it. The FPS loss could also just be from wearing in day of gameplay, or it could be a bit of both. But now I'm going to be moving on to two other things Sabre sent me: a CNC metal string rifling attachment called a SCAR, and also a CNC metal bearing rifling attachment called a BCAR. The SCAR comes in gold anodized aluminium, and it will be included with a future blaster Sabre are still working on. The BCAR, however, is available separately, and it comes in a bunch of different colors, which I'll put a link to down below. Neither of these accuracy devices come assembled, so I did have to spend about probably 20 minutes installing all 30 of the bearings as well as the included strings into that one. They're pretty simple to put together though, and Sabre have instructions on their product page. The string SCAR is an attachable version of their integrated barrel SCARs, so it was actually tight enough inside that it would add effective barrel length to your blaster. Meaning if your barrel's too short, in some situations it may actually increase your velocity. The BCAR doesn't add effective barrel length, but it should impart the same amount of spin as a string one, just without as much of a velocity drop. Both of these fasten onto the barrel with grub screws, but unfortunately, the shorter of the two Seagull barrels is just a hair too short to fit either of these fully. You could still try them, but you'll be shooting from your barrel across a small gap into what is essentially another tight barrel, and that could throw off the accuracy a bit. The protruding barrel length required is a minimum of 40mm for the string SCAR or 27mm for the BCAR. And the shorter barrel option of the Seagull only has 25mm poking out, so 2mm too short for the BCAR. To give these the proper conditions for testing, I'm just going to use the longer barrel. But I'll start out with a chrono test of the Sabre SCAR. 233, 222, 220, 221, 232, 219, 228, 237, 224, 247, 245, 237, 229, 241, 234. That's all 15 of those. The long barrel with the Sabre SCAR shot a high of 247, low of 219, average of 231, with a standard deviation of 9. It lost 16 feet per second over the plastic Worker rifling, but to be fair, it's putting a lot more spin on the darts. It also adds effective barrel length, which with the air volume of the Seagull, could potentially be too long for the blaster. Now try the Sabre BCAR, which shouldn't lose as much FPS as the string one, but it should still provide the same amount of spin, and we'll find out later in the accuracy test. 241, 232, 241, 239, 238, 238, 252, 253, 231, 246, 252, 240, 258, 259, 255, and that's all 15 of those. The Sabre BCAR shot a high of 259, low of 231, average of 245, and it had a standard deviation of 9.1. Compared to the orange plastic Worker rifling, it lost only 2 feet per second on average, but I know for a fact it puts a lot more spin on the darts. But which of these will perform best in my 30 meter or 98 feet for you Americans. Accuracy test. Let's find out. First up, I'll shoot the Worker plastic rifling for a baseline, then the SCAR, and I'll end with the BCAR, sharing the results at the very end. Okay guys, first up we got the Worker rifling, still using Worker bamboos. Let's see how it does. Hit. That just whirly-birded straight up in the air and went over the fence. Don't think the camera will even be able to see that one. Hit. Hit. Miss to the right. Just hit the left of the target. Just missed to the right, I think over the top of the target. Hit. 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 That was a bit low. But that's all 15 with the Worker rifling. Honestly, don't think it's putting enough spin on the darts at this velocity. It might be okay for lower velocity blasters though. Let's change it out for the Sabre gold string rifling. Okay, so now I have the string rifling from Sabre. Gonna aim at the exact same spot. Hit. 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 They're going a bit lower there. Hit. It is reducing the velocity compared to the Worker one, but it's actually doing more spin to the darts. Hit. Cinder block just below. Hit. Hit. That went too short. Cinder block below. Hit. 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 That's all 15. So obviously this is putting more spin on the darts, reducing velocity a bit. So you would have to aim a little bit higher, but it is resulting in a much better grouping than the Worker rifling. And now finally the Sabre 30 bearing SCAR. Aiming at the exact same place as the last two shots. Hit. 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 hit, 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 hit. Alright, I think that speaks for itself. If I can tell just from back here at 30 meters that the bearing SCAR wins, wait till we get back on the computer. From a distance of 30 meters away, as expected, the Worker rifling shown in red was the worst of the bunch. It shot a spread 1.5 meters in size, actually larger than the target itself, and it was unable to stabilize the darts with enough spin, one shot even whirly-birding over the top. The Sabre SCAR in yellow, which lost 16 FPS on average in the chrono test, very obviously had more of an effect on the darts, achieving a spread 70 centimeters in size, half the size of the Worker rifling. The SCAR shots did drop lower on the target though, so as a shooter, you just aim a bit higher at your target. If both rifling attachments were zeroed in for your sight, here's both spreads centered over the target. As I now add in the Sabre BCAR in white, it doesn't really need any correcting. I mean, it could be adjusted slightly more to the left, but compared to the other two, it was already pretty much spot on. The BCAR was the clear winner, achieving a spread 55 centimeters in size, or 1/3 of the size of the Worker rifling. The BCAR also only lost 2 FPS over the Worker rifling, so I think it's gonna have to be my new favorite. As for the upgrades overall as a whole, I have to say the Sabre metal parts were definitely an improvement over the stock Seagull. And the exact same upgrades could be done to a Harrier. The velocity is now far more consistent, accuracy has improved, and the long-term durability of the blaster itself now has metal parts to rely on instead of plastic. For a blaster like this, where you want consistency, reliability, and accuracy, I think for those who can afford them, the metal parts are a very nice upgrade indeed. And the Sabre BCAR would make a nice addition to any other Springer as well, with a 16mm outer diameter barrel, which is pretty much all of them these days. You can find everything you saw in the video at Out of Darts in the USA or Foamwork Adelaide in Australia, or even from Sabre themselves linked down below. That is except for the gold SCAR barrel, that's coming with a future blaster, which I might just have a video on coming next week. You might just have to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss that video. That's all I have for you today. Consider leaving a like or dislike to let me know what you thought of the video. Here's 2 other ones you might enjoy, and as always, thanks for watching. See ya.